Hello class, this is part 3 of lecture 2, context for the birth of the black church. And I'm only going to take a second to finish that up, and then we're going to move on into lecture 3, arguments for the African origins of Christianity. The birth of the black church. We left off talking about a clash of theologies, African people answering those questions. What do we believe about God, humanity, salvation, and the role of the church, differently than Europeans were answering those same questions. But when the two peoples came together, there was a conflict. African people were powerless, were subservient to whites, and one of the ways that African people dealt with that conflict was to develop a synthesizing approach to religions. A good example of that is in Brazil, when the enslaved Africans there were a part of the Christian faith, the Catholic Church. They were in worship service, worshiping and celebrating all the different Catholic saints, etc. However, they were also covertly holding on to their ancient traditional beliefs by exchanging the Catholic saints for their own venerated symbols of their religions, their own orishas, so to speak. And so while they're in the Catholic Church worshiping on the surface Christianity from the Catholic perspective, they were still worshiping in their own ways and in their own rights. And so that's just one example of how African people synthesized different warring theologies, languages, and names for God, etc., etc. But the birth of the black church, some things to consider. What were the elements, the fertilizing agents that gave birth to the black church? Well, you got to think context, theology, the warring of theology, the needs that we talked about in the video before, when African people went through the whole enslavement process, all those different levels of trauma, the needs that developed from a people that were taken from everything, the fact that they lacked control and authority, something that all people need to exercise in order to feel whole and healthy. And in a powerless situation, that lack created a drive, a need in African people. And so for a lot of those reasons, that helped to give birth to, or at least open the doors to, the birth of the black church. What was the seed from which the black church, its life sprang? Well, you could say African spirituality. African people had been spiritual since the first African woman and man recognized that there was a power greater than themselves. But there's also this divine right to power, something that all people have. All people have a divine right to power and authority and self-determination and self-expression. And so it's this divine right to power that helped to give birth to the black church as well, especially if you're talking in the American context. And if you want to look at the different frictions that brought the black church into being, well, attendance at white churches being segregated, the dynamic black preachers that helped to open the doors to blacks wanting even more to control their own worship space. The separate church houses that were under white control, Massa was moving further and further away and allowing the enslaved, along with a pastor that was still giving the message that was sanctioned by Massa, but moving further and further away and seemingly giving blacks more control of the black church, but blacks fighting and championing for themselves to own and control their own institution. The invisible institution, like we said before, met the needs of the people for more autonomy and more control, and to worship in a freer and more culturally relevant way. Freedom of expression, And then, if you're talking about the founding of the first all black churches, there were roadblocks, there was fear of losing control of the black population. A lot of these black churches, after emancipation, these all black churches that were free, there was a whole lot of pushback that whole time. But so however you answer that question, when was the black church born? There's a lot of food there, or a lot of things from which to draw if you're going to make whatever answer you choose to make. Okay, we're closing that out. We're moving to the arguments for the African origins of Christianity. And so if you're talking about the birth of the black church, like I said, some people say during enslavement, when blacks first walked into the doors of the white church. Some folks say during enslavement, when blacks walked out the door of the white church and snuck off and had their own secret worship services. Others say the birth of the black church happened after emancipation, when black people were free. That's the only way you can actually say it was a black church, with the founding of the AME church and the CME, et cetera, et cetera. But some people say we need to go back further to ancient Africa, since we were the first people who gave the world religion, et cetera, through Kemet and other places. But let's just stick to the Christian context. And if we do that, then if we want to talk about the birth of the black church, well, some people argue the birth of the black church is congruent or consistent with the birth of the first church spoken of in the Bible. The founding of the first church in the Bible can be traced back to the book of Acts. But to understand why or how someone would dare say that was the birth of the black church, well, we need to give you some background information. Point number one, the ancient world was dominated by African people and African culture. Archaeologist Louis Leakey, his wife Mary, son Richard, firmly established that human life began in Africa 3 to 4 million years ago. And you can do your own research. The Making of Mankind by Richard Leakey, U.S. News and World Report from September 16th, 1991. They have an article, Early Man, the Radical View of Where We Came From. Here's a free tip. If you want to be guaranteed to get research dollars, say that you're trying to find the earliest human remains anywhere outside of Africa, and people will throw research dollars your way, because folk do not like the idea that all humanity traced their roots back to Africa. But the more they look, all they end up doing is finding older and older and older remains of humanity in Africa. Many respected historians, both black and white, documented the fact that all early major advanced civilizations were black, African, extending from the continent of Africa to the subcontinent of India. This whole region was known by the Greeks as Ethiopia, or the land of the blacks. And so in ancient times, Ethiopia, the land of the blacks, was not just the modern-day African continent, but it included part of southern Europe, and it extended all the way from Africa proper through Saudi Arabia, through all the way over to India. That was considered the land of the blacks. So when you're talking about ancient civilizations, that's what we're talking about. Godfrey Higgins, 19th century British researcher of the history of religions, writes in his 2-volume work, Anacalypsis, this is a quote, "Human life and human civilization began in the Nile Valley, in some location in the area of what is now Sudan, southern Egypt, Kenya, and Uganda. The inhabitants of these early civilizations migrated north in and along the Nile River, further into Egypt, and east all the way into India. This whole emerging development of ancient civilization was entirely an African phenomenon." And it's important to note that, so many historians have proven that what the world has been taught for so long about Greek philosophers and Greek and Roman civilization, et cetera, have proved that what they gave the world, they actually learned at the feet of African religionists, African mystics, through the African mystery temples, etc. But this is not even that class, so I'm just going to put it out there. You do your own research. But when we're talking about the arguments for the African origins of Christianity, you have to know that background information. The fact that, when we're talking about the ancient world, when we're talking about those who gave the world religion, art, science, architecture, civilization, we're talking about Egypt. We're talking about the people from ancient Kemet. And the Egyptians, the ancient Kemetans, they pointed further south into Africa, into Nubia and Tasseti, Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, as their parents, as the ones who taught them and gave them the enlightenment that they ultimately gave to the world. So, and then you have Cheikh Anta Diop, multi-genius Renaissance man who had multiple PhDs, and he proved through DNA testing that the ancient Egyptians were African because of the amount of melanin in their skin, through linguistic testing and through other tests. It's a shame that we even have to have this conversation, but when we're talking about the ancient Egyptians, we're talking about an African people and just all that African people gave the world. But I guess we have to have that conversation because that's just not what we're taught. We just don't know that. But getting back to the arguments for the African origins of Christianity, it's a three-pronged argument, or three-tier argument. The first tier, the first pillar is geographic witness. Pillar number one. Why is all of this important? Because all of biblical history occurred in a small area of land that was then dominated completely by African people and culture. When we're talking about the story of the ancient Hebrews, we're talking about a biblical story that took place in the land of the blacks at the time when ancient life and civilization was dominated by African people. So just geographically, we're talking about a black story. There's no way to accurately understand ancient Israel as a historical nation or the religious beliefs at the core of their identity separate from the historical background out of which it all emerged. The black church has never made the study of ancient history an integral part of being religious or the study of geography. Thus, most black people talk about religion or the black church in a historical vacuum. The story took place in northern Africa, not Europe, not the quote-unquote Middle East, but a region, like I said, dominated at the time by those who looked like this right here. So geographically, we're talking about an African story. The second tier, or the second pillar of the arguments for the African origins of Christianity, is chronological witness. The Bible story, the biblical history of Israel began approximately 2000 BC, a period when the world again was dominated by African nations. The Bible tells of this group fighting that group, fighting Egypt, and over again we're talking about different African groups. Israel itself was a small nomadic tribe, according to the Bible, that originated around the area of the Babylonians. There's no way, given historical realities of the time, that Israel could be anything other than an African nation. The findings of scholars like Cheikh Anta Diop, John Henry Clark, Ivan Van Sertima, John Jackson, Joseph Ben Jochannan, on and on and on again, talk about their findings that when you're talking about all these different ancient peoples, you're talking about an African people. The timeline of history, there was no European group that came into Africa in a conquering manner until 332 BC with Alexander the Greek coming in and ransacking Egypt. But in 332 BC, the Bible story was already over 1,700 years old before any whites even entered into that land to have any say on what was going on. So again, we're talking about a time when chronologically, if you just look at history and what was going on at different times, chronologically we're talking about an African people. And I implore you, and I hope to post a timeline of ancient world history so that you can see for yourself, because you don't have to believe me. Do your own research. So chronologically, so when you read the Bible story and you're talking about the call of Abraham, which, by the way, Abraham, or his original name Abram, according to the Bible, was from the city of Ur of Chaldea. The Chaldeans, again, historians have tried to figure out who were these Chaldeans, and when they do their research, or when they've done their research, they found out that these were black people. So the patriarch of, well, Abraham was the patriarch of three faiths: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. The patriarch of all three, according to historians, according to where he was born, according to the people from which he came, was an African person. Jeez Louise, okay. But then, if that's not enough for you, that just the chronology of when things happen, if geography is not enough for you, well, the third tier, or the third pillar of this argument is biblical witness. What does the Bible say? Okay, well, speaking of Abraham, like I just said, Abraham from Ur of Chaldea, Chaldeans being an African people. Abraham, the father of the nation, who eventually gave life to Moses. Moses was born of a Hebrew mother and father, Hebrew just like Abraham was and all those who came after him. Moses is mistaken at least twice in the Bible for being an Egyptian. At least twice. When taken in by Pharaoh's wife, as a baby, and then after he fled from Egypt for killing an Egyptian who was messing with one of his Hebrew brothers. After he flees from Egypt, and he comes upon this scene where these people are messing with these young ladies. One of the young ladies who, according to the Bible, later on becomes his wife. He beats them up, or he scares them off, whatever. But then the young ladies take Moses to meet their father, and they introduce him, "Father, we want you to meet this Egyptian who saved us." So the Egyptians, being an African people, Moses is twice mistaken as an Egyptian. David, considered Israel's greatest king, traces his lineage back to these very same people. According to biblical witness, Jesus was of the house of David, was of the lineage, the line of David. Jesus, Joseph, and Mary. This is just all biblical witness. Jesus, Joseph, and Mary. After Jesus was born, Joseph and Mary escaped to Egypt because there is this edict that has been issued to kill all the firstborn Hebrew children, and so Joseph and Mary take their baby to Egypt because they want to escape. And when you try to escape, you go someplace where you can blend in, not where you stand out like a sore thumb. And so they go to Egypt, the land of the blacks, African people, because they're trying to blend in. Jesus was part of a community that traced its origins back to David's nation and Moses' nation, and then all the different scriptures: Jesus, hair like lamb's wool, skin like burnt brass, etc., etc. But those are this is the very short version. Those are the three pillars of the arguments for the African origins of Christianity. Geographically, we're talking about a story that took place literally in Africa, in the land of the blacks. Chronologically, we're talking about a time when blacks ruled and dominated that part of the world. And biblical witness, and I haven't even when I talk about biblical witness, I haven't even talked about the cultural references. Like for African people, community and connection and relationships were the most important thing. To be separated from your people was considered, in the African consciousness, a fate worse than death. Well, one of the first stories of the Bible is Cain killing his brother Abel. Cain slays his brother Abel, and God, according to the Bible, comes and says, "Cain, where's Where's Abel? Cain, I don't know where he is. And God says, yes, you know where he is. And for your crime, you must leave the promised land. You must go. Get out of here. And Cain responds in a very culturally African way, Lord, I'd rather you had just killed me. This is a fate worse than death. And that is like straight out of the African playbook. The notion that I can't be with my people, I can't be with my community, I'd much rather be dead. And there's a gazillion other cultural references throughout the Bible to an African paradigm, African worldview, African way of life. Okay, the church born at Pentecost. So if we're talking about an African people, then, being the original Hebrews, then the church that was born at Pentecost, the one that all Christians celebrate as being the birth of the Christian church, then we're talking about that actually being, for some people, the birth of the black church, because we're talking about black people. The church born at Pentecost, through the experience of the Holy Spirit shared by the disciples, was established then as God's instrument to carry on the messianic ministry of Jesus. Pentecost was an annual celebration of the first fruits harvested in the Promised Land. So Pentecost was actually a liberation or freedom festival. The problem is, while Pentecost was going on, Israel was not all that liberated and not all that free. During the time of Jesus, they were under the boot of the Greeks, Romans. The Jerusalem Church of the Disciples came to being as a radical Jewish sect within Israel. And it is important to note that these first Christians or original followers of Jesus were comparable to the other Jewish sectarian movements that had emerged within Israel during the age of apocalypticism or apocalyptic nationalism. This notion that this evil world is going to come to an end and a world of justice and righteousness will then be born. And they believed at any moment, at any time, this world was going to come into being, and they honestly believed that they could inspire or influence God into bringing this new world order, so to speak, into being. And so you had all different types of groups believing different things about how to bring this world of freedom and justice and self-determination into being. You had the Pharisees. They were the people of the law, the book. They believed if we honor the law to the strictest letter of the law, then God will bless us and we will have a new reality. You had the Zealots, who were more quote-unquote radical or progressive. They believed in direct action, direct protest and action against what they considered injustices and their people being treated like second-class citizens in their own land. Then you had groups like the Baptists and the Mandeans. You had another group called the Essenes. The Essenes believed that Israel, the Hebrews, had grown to be so corrupt and so far away from the way God had wanted them to live that they needed to find a group righteous enough to show God that, no, you still have some people that want to live the way you've called us to live. So the Essenes, they moved out close to the Dead Sea, and they set up their own community, and they sought to be like the new Israel. The Hebrews are so messed up, we're going to take ourselves away, and we're going to show you that you have some people that are willing to live so pure and so close to honoring how you would have us to live, that God will see that we are really trying